So I'd like to thank everyone from Rizzoli for hosting this, and Eric Sanderson for coming to talk with me about water, which I'll do anytime. So I'd like to read a land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to talk about the book a bit, and then Eric and I will talk about the book and Springs and Wells, and then we'll take your questions, okay? So, we are here on unceded indigenous land, specifically the homeland of the Lenape people. We acknowledge the genocide and continued displacement of indigenous people during the colonial era and beyond. The island of Manhattan is Lenapehoking. In Lenapehoking has long been a gathering place for indigenous people to trade and maintain kinship ties. Today, these communities continue to contribute to the life of the city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways as sacred. Okay. So, Springs and Wells of New York. I came across this book. I don't have the original book, but I was doing research on another project and found this book with a bunch of pictures of springs and wells in it, and I started reading it, and apparently it was by this man who wandered around Manhattan and the Bronx on his bicycle and photographed the springs and wells, often posing with children in front of them. And then he made this book, and I thought, wow, what a crazy person. And about 30 seconds later, I realized I was going to do the same thing, except without the children. And when I mentioned it to Eric, he said, oh, I've been waiting for someone to do that book. Because it's sort of like among people that study New York, it's sort of a legendary book, but it's not that easy to find. So I thought, not only could I go to the same places that he went, but I can bring that book back into publication. So the book includes his original photographs and text, and my photographs of what's there now. So I'm going to show you some of them. So, can we turn the lights down? Is there a band with us here? Thanks. And that's the same place. So I'm going to go back and read this. So, April 8th, 1898. This well is about 20 feet north of West 91st Street and about 50 feet east from Riverside Drive, or rather from the road parallel to the drive, which runs some 30 feet west of and below the road. It was the well of Mr. Cyrus Clark's barn, which formerly stood near here, all of which traces of the foundation may yet be seen. The well is about 3 feet in diameter, covered with board platform, on which there is about a foot of earth. In the platform, there is cut an opening about 1 foot across. The well is about 20 feet deep to the surface of the water, and there are 3 iron pipes leading up from the water, one running north, one southeast, and one south. The house was several feet away. Perhaps one of these pipes ran to it. Mr. George Schieffelin owns the property above the Clarks, and one of the 3 pipes is said to have run to Schieffelin's house, which is just south of his present barn. The pumps seem to be connected now, and the well is kept covered with several pieces of flagging. There is a large slab of brown stone, which is probably used to serve as the well top. It has a hole about 1 inch in diameter in its center, through which a pipe perhaps protruded in former times. Except on this northeast corner, West 91st Street is built up with fine new houses not a year old. There is a good view of the river from here. The ledge of rock on Riverside Drive at 92nd Street that I climbed up on with some difficulty about 4 months ago, and which was 25 feet high, is nearly all blasted away now. So, and there is this strange thing, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but these are the backs of 2 buildings, and there's kind of a cut in the floor. And I'd like to imagine that there's a stream going through there. I don't think there is, but I like the idea of it. So, and he found a bunch of streams in Central Park, which I found a few of, and a few are actually still flowing. So this is the, okay. Has anyone been to Tanner Spring in Central Park? Okay, great. So, does anyone know how it got its name? I'm going to tell you. On the curving path that runs northeast from West 81st Street and 8th Avenue into Central Park, and about 75 feet north of the northerly line of West 82nd Street, there is a spring that was boarded up by order of the Department of Health. One of the upper boards was, however, soon loosened at one side, and turning on a nail on the other side as a hinge, it became a narrow door. Park employees and all of this section all continued to get their drinking water through the opening, notwithstanding the Board of Health's edict against its use. In July 1880, while Dr. Henry S. Tanner was giving public exhibitions of going without solid food for 40 days, he made almost daily visits to this spring, it is said, and drew from it such liquid sustenance as he was allowed to consume during his public fast. In consequence of these visitations, it became known as Tanner Spring and has ever since retained that designation. Perhaps Tanner's apparent ability to live without eating was attributed to some nourishing element of this spring. At any rate, people came even from distant parts of the town with bottles, pitchers, and pails, which they filled here and carried to their homes. In those days, this spring had an extensive reputation as a specific for rheumatism. After it had been boarded up by the official order, the spring appeared to develop a rebellious tendency, and in August 1899, it forced for itself a new opening near the path 20 feet southwest from its prison. Over this opening, flagstones and rocks had been piled to repress it, but without success, for it broke out again from under these stones and formed a little pool with an 8 by 12-inch surface of clear water from which its old friends drank as pleasurably as ever. After a couple of years, its spirit of persistency was rewarded. The embargo was raised about 1901, the boarding removed, the spring cleaned out and well lined, and it recovered its former popularity. So there it is. That's where my water is from today. This one I'm not going to read to you about, but this is on one of the transverses in Central Park, and it's one of the few that looks almost exactly the same as it did then, except without a spring. This one also, you can actually go visit. It's at the northern tip of Central Park, right in the middle, and there was the water was flowing, and there was a little cup on a chain, and all that's left is a little metal ring that held the chain, and you can go find that. That's right there in the middle. Okay, here's a winter scene. Okay, this is West 115th Street, east of Lenox Avenue. Which looks like that now. So think of the first picture while I read this. December 12th, 1897. On the south side of West 115th Street, east of Lenox Avenue, about in the center of some vacant lots and opposite houses numbered 75 to 79, is an old wooden house inhabited by a German man and his family. He is a lamplighter who has lived here, or within a few hundred feet of the place, for a quarter of a century. He used to have a well under the big tree 50 feet west of this house, the water of which was perfectly good, but some 10 years ago, the health department, in his absence, put Paris green poison in this well to discontinue its use. The health department is really turning out to be the villain here, aren't they? There had always been a moist place behind and south of his house, so after the health department's work, he secured the help of another man and dug another well there. the present one on this spot. He made a large box 4 feet square and sunk it in the hole as the earth was dug out to a depth of 15 feet. There are 4 or 5 feet of water in this well, and it never freezes. It is perfectly clear and is used by the family for every purpose, as they have no Croton water on the place. The old gentleman inveighs against the city supply as being nothing but muddy water, and he says that neighbors who have the latter are fond of coming to his well at every opportunity. His well is uncovered and not very attractive to look into, as his youngest child's chief amusement seems to be throwing sticks and newspapers into it. Okay. Everyone has problems. Okay. And then you can see he really posed children wherever he could get them. This is Broadway and West 124th Street. Just on the line of the curb on the northeast corner of the boulevard, about 20 feet north of West 124th Street, there is a pump. This is now disused, and there is carried on alongside it a Croton water pipe to which is attached a cock by means of which water is drawn. The tenants of the neighboring shanties get their water here. But not anymore. That was Broadway. Okay. This is Fort Washington Avenue at the hospital. And this is called Lechthaler Spring. I won't read you. Some of his descriptions go on for pages and pages, so I'm not going to trouble you with that. You can look at it in the book. September 1897. This spring, Lechthaler's, has the reputation of being the finest kept spring on Manhattan Island. It is some 200 feet west of Fort Washington Road between 168th and 169th Street. Below the spring, a delightful cool glen dips down to the Hudson, if you can imagine. The water comes out of a crack in a large sloping rock and pours into a well formed on the left side of loose stones on the front of brick and cement, and on the other side of rock and cement. The bottom is strewn with round yellowish white pebbles. A platform 5 feet square with a trapdoor in it covers the water and protects it from dust and the cattle which graze around it. The spring never goes dry and the water never freezes. From the spring, for quite a distance down the hillside, there extends a line of receptacles placed a few yards apart, the water being conducted from one to the other through short lengths of pipe. The receptacle nearest the spring is a section of a hogshead set in the ground. Then follow the sections of casks and barrels diminishing in diameter until the line ends with small buckets. So the drinking facilities afforded the large herd of cows is of the most ample nature. Mr. Lechthaler is a milkman with a large outlet. Sometimes he goes back to the same site and he's always amazed that either a road has been paved through there. But this one, a year later, he says, Lechthaler in 6 weeks, or about July 1st, will have finished making a fence and doing other work, and will be at leisure all day and have nothing to do but mind the cows. Then, a few months later, the ducks come to it in a long progression, as do the chickens. The pigeons fly to it. A little girl arrives with 2 pails and a small boy with a milk can. The horses come and the cows. And it's just an entire menagerie up there. We'll skip some of the reading of these, but you'll see that this was the horse farm. Now it's part of Columbia Med School. Okay. I think you recognize that. Okay, I think you'll recognize this building. Same thing. But here it's all by itself. Here, the furthest I could get away was across the street. Okay, I'll let this in. So this is Broadway and Nagle Avenue. One can look down upon a remarkably fine bubbling spring which is widely noted and is called the Traveling Spring. Its waters are clean and deliciously cold on the hottest days. There is a pathetic tale connected with this fountain. 20 years ago, it was 30 yards or more south of its present location, at the foot of an apple tree. Some mischance befell the tree, which withered, died, and was cut down for firewood. Immediately after its death, so the tradition runs, the spring disappeared and was not seen again for half a year. When its period of mourning and seclusion having passed, it reappeared in its present location, removed from its former home, so that each recurring vernal season would not emphasize the loss of its old friend and of the white apple blossoms that the tree was wont to drop gently over it. As might be expected of so sensitive and warm-hearted a spring, it never freezes, even in the coldest of winters. This is the story told to me by an old day laborer, Patrick Kelly, whose spring it is. In view of this propensity to wander, special pains seem to have been taken to guard against another migration. Not only has a barrel been sunk around the spring, but in addition, a stout wooden framework with a solid lid has been constructed over the barrel. And then 6 years later, he goes back and he writes, Kelly Spring has disappeared through the making of Nagle Avenue. So after all that, that's where we end up. Okay. This was a big estate that was in, called the Seaman Drake Estate, between Broadway and Spuyten-Duyvil Creek. Is called the Cold Spring. The Cold Spring is some 800 feet south of its the most northern point of Inwood, and on the east side of it. It is about 100 feet from the shore of Spuyten-Duyvil Creek, or as it has come to be known in its enlarged and modern condition, the Harlem Ship Canal. So everything changed in northern Manhattan and southern Bronx, and I was kind of flying blind when I was looking for some of those springs, so that geography might be wrong. But that's what it's like now. Okay. Move these along a bit. So there's a spring you can visit in Hotel. It even says spring on it. That hasn't changed very much, has it? Okay, you see the cows there, right? So, anyone want to guess what they were replaced with? Ice cream trucks. Okay. So there were a couple times that that Smith came across the fairly new water system. Oh, I should say, So he did this on his bicycle with a box camera on a tripod. I guess he was able to do that because there weren't any cars around, but there are a few pictures where his bicycle makes it into the image, and that's it down on the left side there. But, sorry, I was saying there were a few cases where he finds the water system, which is replacing the wells, or sometimes vice versa. So there were water towers around the city at some of the higher elevations. All of them are gone except High Bridge, which I believe just reopened yesterday. And where's our picture? There we go. So this was called the Morris Water Tower, and there was an estate. Let's see. And he doesn't really say much about that. It's not a spring, so he's not interested. But that's what's there now. And okay, so this one also, the building on the upper right behind the horses, that's part of the Croton system, and he writes about that a little bit. So, Burnside Avenue is a well-traveled thoroughfare. Berkeley Oval touches its south side, and in the season of outdoor sports, residents of Lower New York pass through it by thousands in their rush to and from the railway trains. Opposite the Oval, about 340 feet east of Sedgwick Avenue and a yard from the northern curve, a spring rises directly in the roadway. The water boils up through the sandy bottom of the roadway and runs off into the gutter at its side. A policeman had a small section of earthenware drain pipe 12 inches in diameter sunk around the spring and secured a piece of flagstone to be used as a cover, both to protect it from dust and to prevent accidents to passing horses. The old German man who did the work is seen in the picture. He takes particular pride in recounting how it was done by, quote, me and the corporation being the policeman. There was a Croton Aqueduct gatehouse almost opposite on the south side of Burnside Avenue, and the city water has been laid in this neighborhood. But the spring is used by the neighbors in preference to the Croton water because it is colder and has a pleasanter taste. Children may be constantly seen making pilgrimages from the surrounding houses with pitchers, milk cans, and whatnot to get their family's drinking supply. I do think it's kind of amazing how they all preferred the springs to the Croton system, which now you would say was great water. There it is now. Okay, so this is the one. I think I was in the right place. But like I said, the whole contour of the Bronx and Manhattan has changed. This was something he describes as one of the most forceful springs. And when I came across it, I think it was probably the biggest overflow. I mean, that's a whole pond fed by the spring. That's underneath the Washington Bridge. Sorry, not the Washington Bridge. What's the name of the bridge that goes from Manhattan to the Bronx?
Alexander Hamilton Bridge, you mean?
Yeah, Hamilton.
Which one?
Alexander Hamilton.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. And finally, so right near the New York Botanic Garden, where I did find someone who worked there showed me a couple springs that were still there, that were in the book. And Smith writes about this road as being really treacherous for bicyclists. And this last one, so the one thing I didn't mention about the book is that he has pictures of a lot of the springs, but some of them he just describes and didn't photograph. And I went to those too, and I photographed them. And this is one that he described. He describes a spring being in the front yard of a house. And I went to see that address and found this grating right in the front yard. Is this a drain? Is this a spring? So I have a funny feeling that that is probably a spring. I don't know if anyone there knows that, but it would be something that would be nice to daylight. So.
Where is that?
That is, I can tell you, you can go visit it. It's 1975 Vice, that's V-Y-S-E Avenue, on the west side of the avenue between Tremont Avenue and the proposed 178th Street, which is probably actually there now. So, that's the last of my pictures, and if Eric would come up, we could talk about them. I will introduce Eric, since there's no one here to do that either. Eric Sanderson is the author of Mannahatta and the director of the Wallachia Project, and he works at the Center for Wildlife Conservation.
Yeah, at the Wildlife Conservation
What's-
Society.
Right, one of those.
At the Bronx Zoo, which is what most people know it as. Yeah.
And I think between the two of us, we could probably answer most of your questions about New York, but we're going to talk about the book first.
Well, some aspect anyway.
Yeah, the natural world.
Yeah, well, Stanley, thank you so much for bringing Smith back into our lives.
Thank you for coming to talk.
No, my pleasure. So I have, so I thought we could chat a little bit, and then if you all have any questions,
Yeah.
we can open up the conversation. So I have some questions about springs and wells, and then I have some questions about Smith himself,
Okay.
and then I have some questions about you.
All right, I can do it that order.
Okay. So what is the distinction between a spring and a well?
Spring in a
Well,
well.
A spring and a well, but
Oh.
that's what, springs and wells.
Oh,
I think as far as Smith was concerned, and I'm not sure what we should decide.
Yeah.
Smith came across things that were completely natural that people were just dipping buckets into and hadn't done anything with, and other places where they had actually dug something down to a spring or a water table or something that was much more intended.
Right.
That's right. I mean, do you
Right.
agree?
No, I think that's
Okay.
right. I think,
Okay.
yeah, springs are, normally natural formations.
Right.
And wells are, they're natural, but only because we sort of access the water.
Right.
So
I mean,
which leads to my next question,
Okay.
which I think is important to say, which is, where does the water come from? Why is the water in springs and why is the water in wells?
Well, there's water, and I mean, most of Manhattan was wet at some point, as Eric well knows.
In fact,
You can look
Smith,
at
in the
that.
introduction of his book, says he estimated about 300 springs on Manhattan.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. And he did a little bit of work in Brooklyn where there are many more springs, and I came across springs that were not where he said they were, probably because they were disrupted by things like the water tunnel being built. So there's tons of water underneath us. Lots of cities get their drinking water from groundwater. We don't, thankfully, anymore. We used to, and then it got polluted. But there's this entire water table underneath, and it gets recharged very slowly by water seeping down from rainfall and from lakes and rivers. So, and I'm not exactly sure of the physics of what makes it bubble up. Maybe you know that.
Yeah.
But there are places where it just wants to come out, and there's some places where you need to dig down and pull it out.
Yeah. So that's right. It's the water table,
Yeah.
groundwater, it's under the ground. And it turns out, the water underground, just like water above the ground, follows the topography,
Right.
follows the surfaces. So
It's true. Some of the springs that you can find in Central Park and Morningside Park are high up. So they're still springs, but then the water flows down when it comes out.
That's
so
right.
you think it's a waterfall, but it's really a spring.
That's right. And the water, all the water comes from precipitation,
Yeah.
from the rain and the
Originally.
snow eventually.
Yeah.
And you can imagine there's like the surface topography and then there's the water table. And when those two things meet, those two maps meet, that's where you're gonna have springs.
Right.
And once you sort of get that idea in your head, you can actually kind of look at the topography and kind of figure out where the springs would have been. It's harder, of course, in the city because we built up on top of the topography in all kinds of crazy ways.
Right.
Would have been easier back in Smith's day.
Yes.
You know, most of the ones he writes about are in northern Manhattan, because
Right.
it was still like on the frontier of development, and in the Bronx, which is sort of in the process of being urbanized in the late 19th century when he's writing.
Right.
Yeah.
And you used Smith for your book. to
Yeah,
some degree, right?
yeah. You know, I'm working on this atlas to all the natural features of the city that we take for granted or don't remember. So springs are one of those features. Also the streams and the hills and the topography.
Right.
And so for me, you know, I sort of read Smith and I try and look back through what he's seen to say, well, what does that mean about the landscape that was before, and why would it be a spring there?
Right.
One of the things it's interesting to me is, you know, the bedrock in Manhattan and this part of the Bronx that Smith is working in is much closer to the surface than it is in Brooklyn or Queens.
Yes.
Because of the
Right.
actually the geologically, which is on top of the older bedrock. So that meant, you know, there's not actually much place for the water to go in Manhattan. You know,
Right.
because like northern Manhattan was, you know, 20,000 years ago there was a glacier on there, right?
Right.
And that glacier had scraped off all the soil and all the vegetation, and then it retreated, and when it retreated, it left these sediments of kind of sorted tills and stratified drift, which is actually really good for water to run through.
Right.
On top of the bedrock surface. And then you have, you know, 18,000 years of soil development on top of that. Whereas, you know, Queens and Brooklyn is mostly just big piles of sand.
Right.
Over a much deeper bedrock. So the sort of hydrologic, the groundwater system of that part of the city, Queens and Brooklyn, is very different than the groundwater system in Manhattan. and
Right.
Bronx.
And plus, lots of Manhattan was kind of flat.
Especially lower Manhattan,
Yeah.
down here, yeah, for sure.
I mean, he talks about that a lot. Like he talks about something being blasted away and
Yeah,
it flattened, and you have to go uptown to find
yeah.
what the way it used to be.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I love about Smith is he's like there at the moment that it's being
Yes.
completely transformed, you know.
Right.
Because
The street grid had been laid out much earlier, but
That's
a lot
right.
of it wasn't built until
That's
then.
right. Yeah, he's watching it being built, actually kind of capturing it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Smith's entries where he like goes on, you know, it goes in, I don't know, in April of 1898,
Right.
and he comes back the next year.
And he exclaims, "The spring is gone.
Yeah.
The street is there." And, yeah, and it's a very sad street.
So maybe that's the, yeah, and it's sad for Smith too. He's so nostalgic about it.
Yeah, he is.
You know, he like feels like if he doesn't write it now and get the description
Yeah.
now, it's gonna disappear forever.
Right.
You know.
I
he's like,
wonder
"Wow,
if that
wow."
had anything to do with the timing of his project.
Well, I totally, there's a whole New York City literature that in the late 19th century that's of this sort of nostalgic phrase.
Yeah.
There's a book called The Reminiscences of an Octogenarian that was published in
Right, I've seen that.
1896 or something. And it's
Yeah.
this guy who grew up on Manhattan, who grew up here. And when he was a kid, in the early 19th century, it was all countryside, you know. Manhattan was, I mean, the city was
Yeah.
just extreme lower Manhattan.
Yeah.
And like all of where we are here was farms. And there were streams running through those farms.
Yeah,
You know,
okay.
and little, you know, little copses of trees, and they were catching frogs and catching muskrats and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
then, you know, almost 2 million people moved to the city in the most of the 19th century.
Right.
The population goes from 40,000 to 2.1 million in 1910.
Yeah.
And, you know, imagine that happened in some people's, they're in their lifetime. Can you imagine
Yes.
that?
Right.
To see that?
Right.
And so part of it is when they get older, they start writing these nostalgic accounts of what it was like.
Right.
They try and
They
and
remember.
it's so great they did because people like me and you and we would have no
You
idea.
wouldn't have the history.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's talk about that Smith then. I know you know a little more about his biography than.
So a little bit. Well, so he wrote a book first about springs and wells in Greek and Roman mythology, which I've been looking at Rome a little bit lately, and I wonder how much of it is tied to actual places. So I have to look at that book.
Yeah, I haven't read that book yet.
Okay. And he was a Civil War hero. He definitely was from a family with money because I don't think he ever had a regular paying job, but he had time to wander around and take pictures. So, you know, clearly from a family of privilege. And
he had a bike, and he had a camera.
and a bike and a camera, right. And probably had money to give the kids to pose for him.
Right.
But he did the work between 1897 and 1901, and then didn't do anything with it. And then he left money in his will for a bunch of different things, and I don't think he had any children. And one of the things he left money for was to publish the book, and he left his collection of pictures and money to the New York Historical Society, and they published the book in 1938. He also left money to the Museum of Natural History for some mapping projects.
You were saying
And-
topographic mapping of the states or something?
Yeah, I think that a collection of topographic maps of each state. He left a bunch of money to one of the settlement houses,
Yeah.
and there was something else. And he was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and I actually went to try to find his grave, and I found this enormous collection of Smith family, but not him. And I had the citation from the cemetery map, but I have to go back and try to find him again. He's there somewhere.
What year did he die? You know?
I think it was like pretty close to 1938. It was probably like early 30s. Yeah.
Yeah. When it's the little, through the graphic note, it's very confusing because, you know, the book is from 1938, but
I
actually,
know,
it's
yeah.
all about,
It's a
it's
big
all
difference.
about things that happened,
Yeah.
30 or 40 years before
Right,
that, right?
right,
So,
yeah.
and it is kind of a mystery what happened in those intervening times.
Yeah, what did he
You
do?
wonder.
Yeah.
Why do you think Smith was so obsessed with springs and wells?
I can't explain obsessions. I have too many of them of my own.
Well, I was going to get to that in the third section. But well, let me ask you this.
Well, he was clearly obsessed with water.
Yeah, and why?
I trace mine to things that he'd never seen, so I'm not sure. Do you
Yeah.
have an idea?
Well, I mean, there is something about water that is really special.
Yeah.
And the idea that we could interrupt the flow of water.
Right.
And I mean, you know, I've given many talks over the years, walking tours in Manhattan
Right.
and so forth. You know, where we're talking about the forest and the Lenape people and all the wildlife and the trees and it's so interesting because somehow New Yorkers and tourists who come to New York, they're sort of like, okay, I can accept there's no wildlife here. And, all right, fine, yes, I understand this terrible thing happened with Native Americans and they're not here anymore, and, you know. But then you get to the point and they're like, wait a minute, you're telling me there used to be a stream flowing right here
Yeah.
and it's not here anymore? And they just like, there's something about water.
They can't believe it.
They just can't quite believe
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, for me, it's almost like in the Taoist sense of like water is this, this kind of universal force that's always there. You know, like flowing water is the most beautiful thing.
Right.
It's always different, and yet it's always kind of the same. At the
I
same
think
time.
that's why finding things like, I don't think you can go there anymore, but there used to be a building on Minetta Lane where there was a stream, and you could go in, and on the floor was this little glass window, and you could look down and see the stream. I mean, how amazing was that?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
and if you look, I spent some time doing this, of course. If you look on Google satellite photographs, you can find occasionally buildings that have such a strange shape. The only reason they have that shape is because there's a stream running next to them. Like I found one on 13th Street that had to be that.
Right. Or formerly, like
Yes.
Minetta Street,
Right.
Is in Greenwich Village used to be the path along
Right.
Minetta Water,
Yes.
Minetta Brook,
Yeah.
and Minetta Lane is where the bridge was that went across it.
Right. Right.
Turns out there's an interesting African American connection to that area too.
Oh, really?
Because it was boggy, because it was so wet, and so
Right.
so that was one of the places where African Americans were allowed to live in the late 18th century,
Right.
including some people that had gotten themselves out of slavery and set up shop
Right.
along that stream. It was also an important Lenape site, it turns out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, something else about water, of course, is we all have to drink,
Yeah. I mean,
So.
I've been looking at water supply and water treatment, and I'm fascinated by fish ladders, which basically do nothing, which is another whole project, and dam removals and canals. So I'm sort of fascinated and horrified at the same time when I see what we've done to the water flow.
Yeah, well, and sadly in Hurricane Ida, a lot of people were quite surprised
Right.
about the effects of the old streams were, particularly if you,
Well,
you know.
Well, let's say great Toni Morrison quote that the water remembers where it used to go, where it used to be.
Water. When I was, after Ida, reading the news stories about, the people that died in basements and how terrible that is. And people lost all their stuff that was in their basements.
Right.
And, the politicians, were saying rightly that of course it's horrible that people are so poor and there's enough places people have to live in basements. And that our infrastructure can't actually deal with that much water.
Right.
Like where I live, we got almost 8 inches of rain that night when Hurricane Ida, which is 2 months of rain in about a 6-hour period, right? And our drainage system's only designed to take about 2 inches of rain per hour.
And the water treatment, the wastewater treatment plants can only deal with barely more than a drizzle, and they start to overflow. So we are not prepared.
It's nice how you arranged the rainfall to start, right? Just as we got to this point.
Did it start?
Yeah.
Okay. You're welcome.
Yeah. No, that's right. That's right. So, I mean, I think that's also something that's interesting about your work, right? Because Smith is there kind of at the forefront of urbanization, and you're coming, 125 years later, to taking pictures of the same place, and you can see, it's really...
There's still sign of it.
There's still signs of it, but also how transformed it is,
Yeah.
So many of those places are so changed. And,
Right, it's hard to imagine that there's anything underneath, but if you look, there's probably water underneath there somewhere.
That's right.
Go far enough.
Although, some of the water that's in the groundwater now is actually water that we brought from the Catskills and the Delaware.
That's true.
It comes down the pipes, but then the pipes leak and
Right.
the water flows where it
Well,
used to.
Prospect Park Lake, we watched overflow for a few days, and that's all Catskill water.
Can you
Yeah.
speak a little louder over the rain?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Could we use these?
Oh, yeah. This works. Sure.
I'm gonna try to avoid technology.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, so as a fellow New York obsessive, like Smith was a New York obsessive, what is it about New York City that leads to obsessions?
Just live here. Is there anyone here who doesn't have a New York obsession of some type? I have way too many to count.
Yeah, people in Boise, Idaho have those same kind of obsessions. I mean, what is it about this
About
place?
Boise or about New York?
Well, that's a good question. If you think about it, there's something very special about our relationship to place. It's a very human kind of thing. I mean, all organisms, they have a life history that gets played out in an environment of some sort. But it's a cognitive thing. It's a real thing. I know this because I'm not a New Yorker. I came here 22 years ago from California, and I moved, and it was a shock to me.
Or
It was a
something
cultural
to
shock.
comfort.
Yeah. Well, there's something about that too.
I grew up just always wanting to know how everything worked, and I was in the middle of it, so I was just gonna kind of burrow in as far as I could and figure it out. So,
Yeah.
and I haven't let go of that.
Yeah, that's right. And I also think it's so deep. New York just feels so deep that you can never not keep learning things. I mean,
And it's always changing.
and it's always changing.
Yeah. It's a moving target.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Smith, he had his focus on his springs and his wells.
Yeah.
I wonder, did you notice anything about all the places you went to visit when you were doing the book? Some connection that ties them together beyond Smith?
Not so much. I mean, I always enjoy doing a project that makes me go look at things that I might not look at, and because it always always leads to all kinds of other things that I might not have looked at that I get to see. So, you know, to sort of say you've been to a neighborhood is one thing, and to say you've been to a neighborhood and looked for 15 streams there, or springs there, is completely different. It's a much tighter inspection of things. So I really like forcing myself to do that really detailed look. And you get a sixth sense for certain things. Like, I could tell you what, you know, most manhole covers mean, or where the sewer pumping stations are, or, you know, crazy things like that, that there are probably a few other obsessives in the city, but, you know, most people don't care.
Yeah, well, I also think, as a transplant myself, that you know, you come to New York and so many people are here with the idea of creating something new or creating a new life for themselves or some kind of new ambition. It's you know, it's sort of a famously forward-looking place, you know, future-oriented,
Right.
And not past-oriented. In the same way that, you know, you can't go to London or I see there's one over there from Vienna or Tokyo or Beijing, you know, all these places, all these, you know, major important cities, you feel part of this historical progression.
Mm-hmm.
You know, part of being there is actually experiencing that other people have been there for so long and created it, and it's in some sense, part of that same process. And I don't think we have that. We sort of half of that here in New York for some reason, which means that there are all these weird things about New York that we just either come to adjust to or to accept, or just to, you know, like you were saying, like the shape of the building or the direction of the street, or I don't know, you know, where the subways go or something like that, which actually all do have explanations.
Yes.
You know, they all make sense.
And the obsessive are the ones who want to know all of that.
That's right. Yeah, it's like the city's landscape is constantly foisting questions on you.
Right. And I'm asking them like out loud all the time.
Yeah.
And my wife will be with me, and she won't have the answer. And at some point, we decided she should just say something, and that would quiet me down.
Yeah.
But there's also so you moved here. You know Colson Whitehead's definition of a New Yorker.
Yeah.
It's like when you start missing the things that are gone already. So how long did it take you to get to that point?
Well, you know, I mean, part of my reconciliation with the city was to try and figure out what was here before the city was here.
Right.
And so
So you went way back.
Yeah, in some sense, I'm in a constant state of mourning about I mean, in many ways, the old forests and streams, and even in a weird way, the Native Americans is a little bit closer to my heart than the city that I am today. Even when I'm in, you know, your part of the world in Brooklyn, I always have to think, where am I with respect to the moraine, be able to navigate around.
Right.
Because the neighborhood's
Find
not
a
actually
niche.
needed to me. Like going uphill or downhill, you know. So, what's your favorite one of Smith's springs or wells?
Favorite one? Well, see, that's a tough question because it's all about his description of the spring or the picture, because most of them you can't see. But there's one that I love that he describes, and I didn't read it to you, Jay, but he talks about a spring where a man has a cow, and at some point the cow goes missing, and then he realizes the cow has fallen into his well, and he has to get 3 of his neighbors to come help him pull the cow out. And just that picture of this happening in, you know, like 120th Street in Manhattan, it's just bizarre.
Blows your mind.
Yeah.
And was there a favorite place when you were, you know, rephotographing Smith's places?
Well, I love being in places that I didn't know well. So parts of the Bronx and parts of Upper Manhattan. I spent more time in Inwood Hill Park than I had spent, and that was really great. So yeah, I mean, it's just the sort of forcing me to look at things. So I enjoy that.
Yeah. Inwood Hill Park's one of my favorite places in the city.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. So I know this is a hard question. But what do you, so you you know, so Smith, he's working 125 years ago, say?
Yeah.
So 125 years from now is what, like 2150?
Yeah.
What do you think the city's gonna look like then?
But it's gonna be underwater. Don't you think?
Well, no, I don't think all of it will be
Okay.
underwater.
I think it would be interesting to find the things that were here now, then. And so I'm doing this book about Frederick Law Olmsted now, and he talked about designing parks for 100 years from now. So what are we doing now that in 100 years they'll say, oh, they did that in 2020, that was great, or that was awful. You know, will all of those super tall buildings on 57th Street still be standing in 100 years? I don't know.
Well, what do you think we should be doing? That would people 125 years from now would thank us for?
We should be renaturalizing the coastline, so that the storms don't destroy everything so quickly. That's what I would be doing.
Yeah. Is anybody doing that?
The Oyster Project is doing that in Staten Island, and yeah, just little bits and pieces, it's not systemic.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
sorry to hear that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say, you know, one other thing that I noticed in my 20 some odd years in New York is it's such a future-oriented place, but when you ask people, what do you think that future is going to be?
Right.
They either, I mean, everybody has an idea for themselves. Of course, we're all going to be successful, we're all going to be rich, we're all going to be famous, right? But when you ask, like, what is the city going to be like, you either get this sort of like straight line interpolated response, you know, like, well, you know, we have big buildings, a lot more buildings, you know, like we have
to see about
almost 9 million people, a lot of more people, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they want flying cars, right? It's just like,
No, not that.
yeah, no, I'm not asking you, I'm just saying that's one way to think about it.
Yeah.
And another way to think about it is it's all gonna like fall apart and collapse
Yeah.
on itself.
Right.
But what's so rare, and I think Smith's getting out a little bit, I would like to think your work's getting out a little bit. I try in mine to actually try and create a future that actually works, that actually could have a city that could last for hundreds of years. And that seems to be the kind of moves that we need to be making now. Not to take from the future, but actually give a future to the city.
And maybe that's partly by bringing back some of the things we destroyed in the last 100 years.
Springs and
The
wells.
natural parts of the city, you know, more parkland, more trees,
And even
fewer cars.
And even making some sacrifices along the way to make
Oh,
that happen.
definitely, a lot of sacrifices will be required, yeah. Should we
Yeah.
ask for questions?
Yeah.
And, yeah,
So what are some different manhole information that you know about?
what are some, what?
Like the information on the manholes, when you,
Well, we have to get into specifics, but I've walked the routes of all the water tunnels, so I know where all of those, there were shafts every couple miles, so there's a bunch of weird, sometimes square manhole covers, sometimes manhole covers that say Catskill water system, there are little standpipes, there's all kind of weird stuff. That will be in another book. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a question about the water quality in general, and if there was a lot of stories like one particular well that ended up making a lot of people sick, and he talks about that, it had a special.
Oh, the fever spring.
Fever spring, right?
Yeah.
Was there more of that in the book, or are there more springs that were full of this wonderful, healthy, nourishing water?
What struck me was that almost whenever he commented in that way, it was almost always about how the people who had access to that spring preferred it over Croton water. It was colder, it was sweeter, it tasted better, the Croton water was bad. So he was almost always preferring the spring water over whatever else there was.
How long had Croton water been around at that time? Just a few years?
So Croton water was like 1842.
Oh, okay.
But what's interesting, I didn't hit me until I looked at springs and wells, but there's a great photograph by, now I'm forgetting his name, the great Indian photographer. Anyway, it's of a giant aqueduct flowing, like exposed, like above ground, going through a ghetto in India, and none of the people near it have access to that water. And you think, this is tragic, you know, they're spending tons of money to bring water into the city, but who gets to use it? And you read Smith, and he talks about all these places where you know the Croton Aqueduct is going by there, and the people right there haven't been connected to it yet. So, and this is 1900, so it's 60 years later. So I never realized that it took that long to get everyone connected up. Maybe it's more about that the communities that existed when the aqueduct was built were connected first, and the new communities weren't connected quickly. So I have to research that a little bit. But I was surprised to see so many people so much later still didn't have access to that water.
Yeah, I think it also has something to do with class a little bit, you know.
I'm sure,
that-
like the way people
live
run on
downtown.
table today,
That's right.
which is less important than water, but
That's right.
same principle.
Because, you know, the Croton water was really meant to bring water all the way downtown, right? And,
Yeah, to see
you
it
know,
all.
Yeah, all the way, you know, to the receiving reservoir in Central Park, the
Yeah.
Oakville Reservoir, and then to the one at 42nd Street where the
Right.
library is today.
And then there was a fountain at there's a fountain in City Hall Park at the same place as where there was a fountain, that was the end of the system, but it's not the same fountain. Yeah,
I have a question for each of you, if that's okay.
okay.
Please?
My question for you is, City Limits put out an article this morning that was about how there's essentially no policy or reporting system for places that have been flooded. And they kind of nodded towards the possibility for historical mapping to be used as the only resource. What do you think that GIS mapping and like work like yours could do towards providing some kind of database or policy or something that tenants could have access to?
Hmm.
And my question for you is what you thought about the daylighting of the Tibbetts Brook.
You wanna go first? Or?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Yeah, I was quoted in that article. And we have maps now of all the streams all the way across the city and all the wetlands. And we're building a website so that that'll be public information. Although the DEP, you know, they actually have a pretty good idea already because they have a map of extreme flooding reports that they've been collecting from 311 and so forth. And when they showed me that map, I said, well, that's a map of the streams. Because it's really quite extraordinary how closely it maps out on the streams. And particularly some streams that people haven't heard of in 100 years, but are still shown on those maps. So yeah, and I've also been fielding a lot of calls from the DEP specifically about specific places where they might someday do buyouts. I mean, the DEP knows that they have a major problem. They actually, you know, they had a report in May, but they estimated to upgrade the city's storm drain system to handle what's predicted with climate change would be a $100 billion proposition. And there's no money.
And that doesn't include things like rain gardens, that's just,
No, it would be bioswales,
Yeah.
green roofs, but also, you know, much bigger pipes, right?
yeah,
If we want,
and storage.
in some sense, you know, the storm drain system is our streams, right?
Yeah.
It's our replacement for streams, and the whole point of it is to allow us to have pavement so we can have cars and, you know,
Yeah.
and then we can cover so much of the city in concrete, right? Which then, you know, if you pour water on a rock, what happens? It just runs right off.
Yeah.
Pour water on, you know, your backyard, it infiltrates into the ground slowly. The soil's like a sponge, and we've created a city where we've covered the sponge with this like thin layer of rock, and then we tried to engineer our way out of it, and
Insane.
yeah. I mean, over a small area, if you have enough concrete, enough money, sure, you can do, I guess, what you want. But over the size of an area of New York City, it's just impossible, and it's, you know, it's going to drive all the things that we were just talking about.
Right.
Inequities about who gets the service and where. where the damage is gonna be. So anyway, it's coming.
So, you asked about Tibbetsburg.
Yeah, I know that they're working on daylighting it.
Yeah, so does everyone know about Tibbetsburg in Bronx? Okay, so he actually, I don't think I read that one today, but Smith actually talks about Tibbetsburg flowing into the Harlem River, which is what it used to do. Now it goes into a sewer, which means it goes through the wastewater treatment plant, so we can't deal with there's just too much volume. So the idea, and this is happening all over the world, is to daylight streams that we've covered up. So uncover them and let them flow where they used to go. And not only is it just a fantastic idea in terms of bringing some nature back to the city, but it's great for dealing with wastewater, and it's great for economic development. I mean, it's great for so many reasons. And we should be doing it times 1,000 in the city. And Tibbetsburg, I think, has, it's like probably 4 or 5 phases of bringing it back, and they're just thinking about the first. I mean, they're well into the design of the first phase, but it's just going to take them forever. They need to do this faster.
One little added piece of that is, Tibbetsburg used to go right through the Kingsbridge section of the Bronx.
Yeah.
It was in the salt marsh and went back and forth like this.
Right.
The place they're talking about daylighting is along the railroad, the former Putnam
Near,
Railroad
yeah,
tracks,
it's near the,
right near the Major Deegan Highway.
yeah.
So it's very straight, so it's gonna be a very straight stream as opposed to the winding stream that used to be there. But one of the city's big problem is the railroad company that still owns the rights to that land. They're not using it for nuclear, but they're playing hardball with the city and they want a lot of money. Even though the city got the same railroad company to donate the High Line, but that's down here on the
Right.
Bronx, of course, right?
Okay.
So that's one of the holdups now. But DEP is really keen on that project because, because Tibbetsburg is not just Van Cortlandt Lake and what we see in the city, it goes way up in the Yonkers. And so all that area in that valley, when Ida came, lots of water came down there. And that's part of why the Major Deegan flooded so badly.
Okay.
Because the storm drains from the Major Deegan couldn't take the flow coming out of the Deegan, because they were also taking all the flow from Tibbetsburg.
Right.
And so, I want flooding on the Deegan, and of course, God forbid that the trucks can't go from the Deegan, they can't get to Yankee Stadium or whatever, then you're gonna have to deal with Tibbetsburg.
And also, whenever it rains and the wastewater treatment plants have to dump the untreated sewage into the bay, they have to pay a fine. I mean, it adds up to millions of dollars, I'm sure. So they even have a financial incentive to do it. They're just, there needs to be a mayor who makes a priority out of this. So, yeah,
So, I know from the V-Lane map and from Wallachia and from 5B, play 5B in your book, the Montagna rivulet, which flowed into the swampy thing that became the Harlem Mere. But there was this block wide.
Sweet red maple swamp, yes.
Okay. So on the V-Lane map, it shows this block-wide river on 106th Street going from 5th Avenue flowing into the East River.
Yeah.
Which seems, I guess that's why 106th Street on the east side is kind of wider there.
That's exactly
But it just seems like this amazing that they would have concreted that block-wide stream going from 5th Avenue into the East River. Is there any discussion at all of opening up that stream? And I'm also wondering why that wasn't a little bit, if there was any more information about that. It just seems like such an amazing feature of the landscape.
Yeah, that's Harlem Creek.
well, there was also one, wasn't there either a deeper marsh or a stream that ran the route of 125th Street?
Yes.
That they
That's
actually
Harlem
considered making a canal and cutting across the whole island.
Yeah, there was a Harlem Canal Company.
Yeah.
It was very short-lived, like in the 1830s and 40s. They had a whole thing, they were gonna cut the island in half through Manhattanville Pass, or the Holloway, right, where the, on 125th Street, from West Harlem, where
Wow.
on the university. So
They divide themselves.
that creek began up there, and a bunch of streams that came down either side of Harlem Heights and Morningside Heights, and then flowed across the Harlem Plains, kind of along the line of St. Nicholas Avenue there, and then turned and came down, and then opened into a tidal inlet, which is what you're referring to.
Oh, so it started north of?
Yeah, it started north. There's a fault, there's a fault in the ridge there, and that fault has a line. But even though the fault is just on 25th Street, the line goes underneath all of Harlem there, and that's what the water was following. Yeah.
And did that fill up also the Harlem Mere too, or did that come from the Montana?
Yeah, no, well, that's where they met basically, is in a wetland system. That was actually a very interesting one. It was fresh water and then sort of saltier at the bottom, so you would have these brackish marshes go down and transition to and then a full salt marsh at the tidal inlet, kind of this, where the Harlem Mere kind of comes around the corner.
Yeah.
That would have been salt marsh there. And then, so when you stand like on the corner of Fifth Avenue there, between the Harlem Mere and 106th Street, that's where you could take a rowboat all the way to the East River along there.
And is there any discussion at all of daylighting that?
I don't think so.
I haven't
But-
heard any discussion of
but-
any day on which I would say this, have you?
No, I mean, well, there is some on Staten Island, the Blue Belt. on Staten
Okay,
Island.
sure.
They do both things. And then
Yeah.
Sawmill River in Yonkers is also
Right.
a
Okay.
famous daylighting project. But the only one I know that's being talked about actively in the city is Tibbetts Brook. Yeah. I know that when I was writing about Harlem Creek for the book I'm working on now, I found this account that even up into the 90s, the subway stations there along Harlem Creek have been flooding, and they actually closing it for a long time and doing a whole bunch of work. So Harlem Creek is not going anywhere. Same thing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
One more? Yeah.
What inspired you to make the book? I'm sorry if you already said. Just
I'm
curious.
sorry, I didn't hear your question.
So what inspired you to make the book?
When I found the original book in the library, I thought, what a crazy idea, and why don't I do that? I mean, it was really that immediate, I didn't need to think about it. It was like, this is obvious, I have to do this.
Yeah. And thank you for doing so.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I called Eric, he said, oh, I was waiting for someone to do that. So I'm really glad I did.
Is it gonna be a layer in Wallachia, the Smith and?
Oh, yeah. One of our things is compiling all the springs. There's other sources of spring information from other parts of the city. I just wish I wish Smith had written about Brooklyn.
I know, I do too. I found one picture, I went to look at this whole collection at Historical Society, and I found one spring, I think it was on Court Street, but that was all I found in Brooklyn.
Yeah. There's some others.
Someone else.
Yeah.
Oh, it's harder to get there on your bicycle.
Yeah,
Wasn't there a Brooklyn Water Works that under,
well, sure. In fact, you explained to me when I was taking the subway to high school why the Newkirk Avenue station always flooded, which said Flatbush Waterworks used to be there. And I'm looking at maps of Brooklyn, all those inlets that you drive or bike over on the Belt Parkway, those came much further into Brooklyn than they do now. I mean, now they're kind of cut off, but they come miles and miles.
Yeah, all the way up to the Moraine in most
Yeah,
places.
exactly.
Because the Moraine is one of those places where the water, you can imagine the water surface, the groundwater surface and the topographic surface meeting, right?
Right.
It's following like the line of the hills, but then the hills break, and that's where the water would come out, and that's why you would have surface springs there.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to thank both of you for the work you do to encourage and inspire all of us, New Yorkers, to think about nature, think about what's in the ground, think about the air we have, the trees, all of that. It's really important because I think a lot of people just think of trees as outdoor furniture, and they're just so used to this urban jungle we live in of